Tonight, we begin with a development that Western intelligence officials had feared, anticipated, and quietly prepared for. An escalation that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in mere days. Days that brought Russia's most advanced hypersonic weapon crashing into Ukrainian cities. Days that saw Ukrainian drones penetrate hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory. Days that forced Moscow to confront a reality it had long tried to ignore. What Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a line that NATO had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, persistence, and strategic calculation. For weeks now, there had been signals. Not official statements, not formal warnings, just signals that Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been methodical in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a script. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this month was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators: the sudden repositioning of strategic missile units, the evacuation of civilian observers from test ranges, the activation of command bunkers used only for major operations, the sudden communications blackout from key military districts. All of that went quiet. And whenever Putin's military apparatus goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early Thursday morning, Ukrainian air defense systems detected what they described as a ballistic trajectory unlike anything seen in this conflict, including flight characteristics that had not been observed in over 18 months. These are the kinds of weapon systems that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, dominance, technological superiority, or psychological intimidation. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing posture. And when nuclear-armed powers shift strategic posture without explanation, even by small measures, the entire world pays attention. The weapon was the Oreshnik, Russia's intermediate-range hypersonic ballistic missile system. Putin himself confirmed the strike in a televised address, describing it as a test of Russia's latest strategic capabilities. The missile struck Dnipro, not a random target, not a symbolic gesture. Dnipro, a major industrial city, a logistics hub, a symbol of Ukrainian resilience. The strike killed civilians, it destroyed critical infrastructure, and it sent a message that Putin believed would force Kiev to reconsider its strategy. The warning issued by NATO officials after the Oreshnik strike was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior defense officials after emergency consultations described Putin's move as destabilizing, provocative, and perhaps most importantly, strategically counterproductive to his own goals. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response this week was among the most strategically calculated we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 72 hours of the Oreshnik strike, Ukraine launched coordinated drone operations deep into Russian territory. These weren't the commercial quadcopters modified for military use. These were long-range strike drones, systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to hit strategic economic targets. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Ukrainian forces launched precision strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, including refineries that had recently been upgraded for what analysts believe was increased production capacity to fund the war effort. Ukraine struck before Russia could fully secure these facilities. They hit the Ryazan oil refinery. They hit the Novoshakhtinsk facility. They hit fuel depots that were likely preparing to support Russia's winter offensive operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted Russia's economic lifeline, the revenue stream that would have made continued large-scale operations sustainable. This is what made NATO's warning so urgent. Putin's Oreshnik deployment wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of escalation that could trigger wider conflict if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target civilian centers. They didn't pursue maximum casualties. They hit economic infrastructure. They hit Russia's ability to sustain the war financially. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence agencies now believe that Putin's latest escalation was designed to test the resolve of Ukrainian leadership after months of grinding attrition warfare. Putin wanted to see whether Ukraine would negotiate from weakness, but instead, the opposite happened. Kyiv didn't flinch. They launched a counterstrike campaign that was so coordinated, so economically targeted, that even Moscow's defense ministry took notice. You don't get Putin's attention easily. But this week, Ukraine did. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's Oreshnik deployment as strategic signaling, a way to demonstrate capability without crossing the nuclear threshold. But Ukraine proved this week that they remained both resilient and adaptive. Their drone strikes were not only precise, they were timed so perfectly that multiple facilities were hit within a narrow window, overwhelming Russia's air defense capacity. That timing matters because it shows operational sophistication. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian aggression. They are shaping the battlefield. As reports continued coming in throughout the weekend, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian intelligence-directed drones carried out strikes on at least 6 major oil facilities, forcing temporary shutdowns that cost Russia millions in lost revenue. Long-range strike systems targeted ammunition depots that had been stockpiled in the last 4 months along the Ukrainian border. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces operating inside Russia reportedly sabotaged railway lines used by Moscow to transport military equipment to the front. This wasn't just tactical retaliation. This wasn't just tit-for-tat responses. This was strategic degradation. This was economic warfare. And economic pressure is the one thing Putin has struggled to maintain since Western sanctions began choking Russian revenue streams. For every territorial advance Russia has made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Moscow's ability to sustain operations. Remember, Putin thought NATO would fracture under pressure. He thought Western support for Ukraine would wane as energy prices rose. He thought Kyiv would negotiate from desperation. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. NATO remains unified. Western military aid continues flowing. Ukraine is striking deeper into Russia than ever before. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under mounting domestic pressure. Hardliners want total military victory. Oligarchs want sanctions relief and economic stability. The military wants more resources and clearer strategic objectives. The Russian public wants an end to casualties and economic hardship. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has lasted far longer than he anticipated. And when leaders in that position make sudden escalatory moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. NATO's joint statement, now circulated among all member states, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to tolerate nuclear saber-rattling or strategic weapons deployment as bargaining tactics. Officials said plainly that Russia's Oreshnik deployment was inconsistent with responsible nuclear stewardship and international stability. That is diplomatic language for, you just made a serious mistake. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, resolute speech last night. He said, "Russia believes that showing us their weapons will make us afraid." He said, "But fear is not what they will find in Ukraine." And he said, "Every strike they launch will be answered, not with fear, but with resolve." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leadership that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest escalation wasn't isolated. Along with the Oreshnik deployment, Belarus also increased military exercises along its border with Ukraine. Russian naval forces intensified activity in the Black Sea. Russian cyber operations increased targeting Ukrainian critical infrastructure. All of this happened within the same week. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a major winter offensive aimed at seizing more territory before potential peace negotiations. Another is that Russia is attempting to freeze the conflict along current lines through intimidation. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to demonstrate capabilities that would make Western intervention too risky. But this week, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't retreat into defensive positions. They didn't scale back operations. They didn't signal willingness to negotiate from weakness. They struck back at Russia's economic foundation. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine will collapse under sustained pressure. Ukraine wants to show that they can impose unacceptable costs on Moscow. NATO wants to prevent this conflict from escalating beyond Ukraine's borders, and the Kremlin wants to prevent domestic unrest as the war drags on. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian military communications for signs of further escalation. They say Putin has convened emergency Security Council meetings 3 times in the past week. They say Russian air defense systems are being repositioned to protect critical infrastructure from Ukrainian strikes. And they say Russia's decision to deploy the Oreshtik is likely part of a broader strategy intended to demonstrate resolve before potential negotiations with the incoming US administration. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is intensifying pressure. Their response this week, coordinated, economically devastating, and strategically sound, sent a message to Moscow that intimidation will not work. And it sent a message to the West that Ukraine remains a capable, determined partner worth supporting. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with the Oreshnik deployment. But what we do know is that Ukraine's counterstrike campaign was timely. It disrupted Russian economic planning. It demonstrated Ukrainian operational reach, and it reminded the world that this conflict is far from decided. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next few days. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as the turning point toward wider conflict. If they reconsider, Ukraine and NATO have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quieter than usual. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is reassessing. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because this week, Putin learned something he should have known from the beginning. Ukraine will not be intimidated. Ukraine will not negotiate from fear. And every escalation Russia launches will be met with a response that hits where it hurts most. Russia's ability to sustain this war. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine has demonstrated that they can strike back. Russia has learned that escalation carries a price, and the world is watching to see who blinks first. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.